Late last April, Bridget Behan, then matron of a private nursing home for the aged, received a cheque for £10,000. The money was paid to her by Mrs. Rosalind Fortescue, one of the old ladies in her care, for the foundation of a rest home. In June, old Mrs. Fortescue died of pneumonia, and today in Fulchester Crown Court, the matron is charged with obtaining the money by deception. Mr. Lotterby appears for the Crown, Miss Lewis represents the accused, Mr. Justice Mitchenor presides.
All stand.
So, to summarise, Mr. Fortescue, on April the 27th, you heard from your mother's bank that your mother just paid a cheque to the accused for £10,000. So you drove over to the nursing home, asked to see your mother in private, only to be told to wait in the matron's office, correct?
Yes, the residents
were just having their evening meal, quite so. And then?
Well, when my mother finally came in, straight away she asked if the matron could stay in the office with us. When I objected, she said that they had some news for me and that it concerned Behan because they were going into partnership together to start a rest home for old people. Of course, I was appalled.
This was the first time that you'd heard of the venture?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, if you'd known my mother, she was gentle, simple, unassuming, always had the most sheltered life, certainly no business experience. Here she was at 75, writing out cheques for thousands of pounds and running on about leases and partnerships with this Irish woman. I mean, it was ludicrous.
So how did you respond?
I asked Behan to send for Mrs. Halls.
Yes. There's Mrs. Susan Halls, who is manageress and part owner of the Halbert Martin nursing home.
Yes.
Yes. Why did you ask for Mrs. Halls?
Well, frankly, at the time, I was more concerned about having a few minutes alone with my mother to try to find out what sort of hold this woman had over her.
Did it work? Did she leave you alone with your mother?
Not her. She simply rang for a nurse and sent her for Mrs. Halls. Then, while we were waiting, she asked me why I'd come to see my mother.
The accused asked you that?
Yes. So I told her that my mother's bank had advised me about the cheque for £10,000. Of course, my mother was a bit upset.
So the cheque was made out to whom?
The matron.
The matron. And how did the matron react?
Well, she got angry. She said something about me spying on my mother, for heaven's sake. Oh, then she made a great show of soothing her as though I'd in some way abused the old lady.
And then?
Well, Mrs. Halls came in and I told her about the cheque. Naturally, she asked what all the money was for. Behan said that it was to buy the lease of a property, the one they were supposed to be converting into the rest home. Then Matron Behan turned on me and said it was no good my trying to sabotage my mother in this because they'd already bought the lease paid for.
The accused told you that she had already paid the £10,000 for the lease?
Yes, definitely. Well, of course, I asked her where the place was. The very least one would want to take a look at it. But Behan said no, that it was their secret and I must wait until it was all converted and ready.
So she refused to tell you the address?
Yes. I think my mother might have told me, but with the matron standing over. I asked Mrs. Halls and Behan to let us alone, but the matron insisted that my mother was far too distressed by then and asked me to leave.
And did you?
Yes, but only after I'd taken charge of my mother's checkbook.
You took a checkbook?
Yes. Well, my mother had her handbag on her lap. I simply picked up the handbag and took the checkbook.
Why did you do that?
Well, I was extremely concerned for her by then. She'd had this mental trouble in the past, even brain surgery. She'd always been sheltered, vulnerable. It was obvious that this woman had exploited her in her enfeebled condition. It was obvious that she had some sort of Svengali-like hold over her.
Yes, I see.
But it seemed the only thing to do at the time.
So you left the nursing home?
Yes, and the next morning I contacted my solicitor about getting power of attorney over my mother's affairs. I felt I had no alternative. Anyway, my solicitor explained that I would need medical evidence, so I then contacted my mother's GP.
Yes, Dr. Paul Pritchard.
Yeah. It was your intention to prove that your mother was incapable of managing her own affairs by reason of her mental disorder.
I was deeply concerned for her.
Yes, so you've told us.
We'd always been very close.
So you contacted Dr. Pritchard?
Yes, and arranged to meet him at the nursing home.
That same day, the 27th of April?
Yes, we met in the matron's office. He insisted on the matron being present.
And did you agree to that?
Yes, though I certainly resented it at the time, and even more so when he told me that he considered my mother to be
yes, in fact, I
perfectly sound
believe,
mind.
as on your previous visit, you became somewhat upset.
Well, to begin with, I had the feeling that both he and the matron were trying to fob me off.
You thought this doctor was in conspiracy with the accused?
Well, not conspiracy exactly.
What then?
Well, simply that Well, she as matron had a lot of influence over him.
Was perhaps capable of influencing his opinion via her own medical qualifications as a state-registered nurse.
Oh, dear.
Also, I had the feeling that they were both determined to stop me seeing my mother.
They refused you access to her?
Well, not refused, but they said they thought it would be inadvisable for me to see her.
Why?
Well, they said it could upset her, harm her health.
Oh, yeah?
Well, I mean, naturally, that made one even feel more frustrated.
And angry?
Yes.
Yes.
What other steps did you take to try and protect your mother's interests?
Well, I hired an inquiry agent to try to find out where this secret property was.
The place that Miss Behan claimed to have leased.
Yes.
And was this successful?
Eventually, yes, in mid-May, he followed her there. She went with an old man, Toby Drew. And
Just a minute. Mr. Lotterby. Oh, we're not going to be hearing from this inquiry agent himself?
The incident is not disputed by the defence, my lord.
Oh, very well.
And once you tracked down this property...
Oh, well, there was still a for sale board up outside, so then I went to the estate agents and learned...
Yes, don't tell us what you learned for the moment. Now, after you'd been to the estate agent, did you go to see your mother again, and did you see her in the company of the accused?
Yes, I wanted to warn my mother, but when I got to the nursing home, Behan did her best to stop me.
How?
Well, she claimed that my mother was ill and that it could be dangerous if I upset her. Now, I'd already been put off once by this line, so this time I insisted. And in fact, my mother wasn't too bad at all.
She was in bed.
Oh, yes, and, well, a bit quiet, I suppose. Anyway, I told my mother that she had been conned.
Conned?
Well, that Behan was lying. There was no lease, that it was a trick, that the property was still on the market.
You killed her! A shot like that, a nail in a coffin!
You will have your chance to speak later. Until then, you must not interrupt. Such outbursts will only prejudice the jury against you. Is that understood?
Sir.
Yes?
You say the accused was present on that occasion?
No, she insisted on it and persistently interrupted when I was trying to tell my mother. In fact...
Yes?
Well, you see, she kept shouting how there was no chance of the money being repaid because it was all tied up in the share market. Now, she was quite beside herself. If my mother was upset, it was largely thanks to her.
You're saying that the accused exacerbated your mother's distress?
Yes, needlessly and heartlessly.
And in fact, it wasn't very much longer afterwards that your mother suffered the fatal pneumonia condition.
Small wonder.
Silence! Now listen to me. One more remark like that, and I will continue this trial in your absence. One more. Is that understood?
Sir.
Oh, sit down, sit down. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Fortescue. Remain there, please.
Now, sir, I'd like to ask you a little more about your mother, her background and so on.
Well, I've said what she was like.
Ah, yes. Yes, gentle, simple, unassuming.
That's right.
And when your father died in 1971, I believe, why did your mother not come to live with you and your family?
Well, she didn't want to. I offered, of course, but she said she thought it best to go to a private rest home. And in view of her medical history, it did seem best for her to be somewhere where there was a permanent nursing staff.
And it worked satisfactorily?
I suppose so.
Really? Did she not keep moving from one home to another?
Well, the first she found rather gloomy. The second, we had trouble with the old man, Toby Drew, I mentioned earlier.
Ah, yes, yes. And then you finally got her into the Hulbert Martin home where, so you claim, she came under the malicious domination of the matron. Unfortunate. However, since you didn't want her to come to you...
Well, there was nothing significant in that.
Really? You've told us your mother and you were very close.
Yes.
My lord, I fail to see the relevance of all this.
Miss Lewis?
My lord, it is my client's contention that far from being close to her son, old Mrs. Fortescue was actively afraid of him. For this reason, she insisted upon secrecy over the business venture with the accused and also insisted that the £10,000 be paid prematurely. This is all highly material.
Oh, yes.
Sir, that is ludicrous. Of course she wasn't afraid of me.
Well, we shall see. Now, you've told us she had no business sense.
None at all.
What did she do with her life? When your father was alive, how did she fill her days?
Well, certainly not business.
What then?
Well, she used to read a lot, do crochet work. She was very keen on the garden. She did the occasional social work, League of Friends, visiting deprived families, that sort of thing.
Did she drive a car?
No, she was hopeless with anything mechanical, and there was no incentive. My father employed a chauffeur gardener chap who drove her around.
She was hopeless with anything mechanical?
Yes, machines terrified her.
Then no doubt it will surprise you to learn that in 1951 she passed her driving test.
Really?
At Denby, the 5th of May, 1951.
Well, if so, she certainly made no subsequent use of it.
No. Well, perhaps that was not her object in taking the test. Now, sir, what books did your mother read?
Books? I'm not sure.
Really? Your own mother, with whom you've told us you enjoyed such a close relationship, you have no idea of her taste in reading?
Well, poetry, historical novels.
Such as? Come, sir, wasn't her taste in novels almost exclusively for the highly romantic, suggesting a prescribed, even a frustrated emotional life?
Really?
All right, if you want an idea of her nature, that's it. Simple, gullible, romantic. Now, are you satisfied? Or would you like to hear the nursery stories she used to read to me?
Ah, but did she, sir? Weren't they read to you by a nanny or a nursemaid, if you like, and then by a governess right through until boarding school?
Well, so what? I don't see that
You
this
don't?
has any...
You've told us you and your mother were very close. You've told us she had no business sense, but how do you know? You hardly knew her. You were brought up by servants. Your attitudes to life were largely dominated by your father.
Father? I mean, to try to drag him into this...
Who was a man well known in Manchester commercial circles for his toughness.
Yes, a businessman, not
a father.
He had no room in his life for domestic issues. He gave what he could, but obviously...
He was keen, I'm sure, for you to follow him into the business.
Naturally.
Yes, to develop the tycoon personality. Tough, objective, insensitive.
Not necessarily.
No, you're not like that. You're not insensitive.
No.
Well, then you must have known in your heart how unhappy you were making your mother by your actions. You must have known how frightened she was of you.
She wasn't. I loved her. You can't say... We were close, I tell you. We were.
Now, let us examine these actions which you say were motivated by love. You've referred to the trouble you had with a Mr. Toby Drew while your mother was at her second nursing home. What was the trouble?
Well, the fellow was trying to get round my mother.
To get round her?
Well, there were complaints from the other residents. I had to visit the manager...
Complaints? About what?
About, their conduct.
I'm sorry.
Well, his conduct, his behaviour towards my mother.
His behaviour?
Look, there was a scandal.
But over what?
Over this affair they were supposed to be having.
Oh, affair. Oh, you mean love affair?
Well, that's what he would have called it, yes.
And what would you have called it?
Look, he was after her money. He was trying to con her into marriage.
Oh, I see. Let's get this clear. Are you claiming that Toby Drew was a common seducer?
Yes, a seducer in that he was after her money. Of course one had to intervene. I mean, it was preposterous. A grubby old layabout just trying to take advantage of her good nature, her gullibility. In fact, he was actually known as...
Yes, thank you. So then you intervened. You arranged for her transfer to yet another home, to the Halbert Martin home, in fact.
Well, she agreed to that. She saw it was for the best.
Really? I
She
wonder.
did.
You see, Mr. Fortescue, I'm putting it to you that she left that home under protest and that her subsequent actions in trying to found a rest home with the accused were all part of a sad and a desperate attempt to reunite with the man she genuinely loved.
Oh, that's rubbish.
Really?
But if that was her idea, she wasn't of a responsible state of mind.
And is that perhaps why you went to see Mr. Drew a week or so before your mother's death? Oh, do you deny that you saw him?
He went to visit the property with Behan, so I assumed
You
that...
assumed what, that he was in conspiracy with? In fact, you warned Mr. Drew, did you not?
I told him that if he
You
started...
told him, Matron Behan's guilty of fraud. You said, if you don't stay away from my mother, she'll be in the dock with her. Am I right?
Something like that.
Yes. So suppose we now look at some of your other examples of filial devotion. The seizure of your mother's checkbook, for instance.
I was convinced she was not responsible for her actions.
Which, of course, led to your next loving act, your attempt to get her doctor to say she was mentally disturbed. And when that failed, your attempt to disillusion her about the accused. Your mother was sick, confined to her bed, in a confused state of mind, and yet you insisted on bringing her this shocking news. You've been conned, Mother, you told her. This Irish woman, who you've been foolish enough to trust, has tricked you and lied to you.
You make it sound...
Sound what? Sound bad? Well, bad or not, the fact is that within a fortnight of your telling her this, your mother was dead.
Sir, that's a monstrous implication. Do I have to submit to this innuendo? If anybody was responsible for my mother's death, it was her, that creature there.
Ah, and is that perhaps why you insisted on a coroner's inquest?
Yes, since you ask, yes. She dominated the poor old soul. She forced her to part with her money, and then when I stepped in to stop it,
She killed her?
Well, she interfered with her medication, the pills she was on.
Ah, but the coroner's report confirmed the cause of death as pneumonia. See, Mr. Fortescue, I put it to you that your actions, not only with regard to my client, but also with regard to Mr. Toby Drew, the man your mother loved, suggest anything but closeness, love, or understanding for your mother.
Was it wrong of me to try and protect her?
Protect her? On the contrary, sir. I think you've demonstrated an almost pathological determination to protect your £100,000 inheritance.
No.
Yes.
Does your lordship have any questions?
Thank you. No. You may leave the witness box, Mr. Fortescue.
I call Mrs. Halls.
Susan Halls, please.
And on the 27th of April, were you called to the matron's office shortly after dinner?
I was.
Would you kindly tell us what happened there?
Certainly. Well, now, let me see. Mr. Fortescue told me about a cheque for £10,000.
Yes?
Well, I asked what it was all about, and he, Mr. Fortescue, you understand, explained how his mother and Miss Behan had this harebrained scheme for starting a home together. Well, then, Matron, who was very angry... Oh, now, I mustn't say that. Matron told Mr. Fortescue that it was too late for him to stop them, and why didn't he stop
Mrs.
being
Halls.
so overbearing and go home before he upset his poor mother even more? Well,
Yes,
then...
excuse me, madam, but did Miss Behan say why it was too late for Mr. Fortescue to stop them?
Why?
Yes.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. She said they'd already bought this place, property.
The accused told you that they had already bought the property. Thank you. Now, Mrs.
Well,
Halls,
of course, Mr. Fortescue wanted to know where it was, but Miss Behan said that that was their secret, and it was then, when Mr. Fortescue asked to be left alone with his mother, that Matron said the poor soul wasn't well enough to take any more of his company, and I'm bound to say I did rather agree with her. Well, at that, Mr. Fortescue took hold of his mother's handbag and, oh dear, helped himself to her checkbook. Well, as soon as he'd gone, we got our Mrs. Fortescue upstairs to bed, and it was all going on for a week before she was
Yes,
up and about
Mrs. Halls,
again, and then
excuse me.
very low-spirited...
Excuse me again, but after you got the old lady to bed, did you discuss with the prisoner everything that had happened?
The
accused, Miss Behan?
Oh, well, yes, of course.
Yes, and what did she tell you about it?
Precious little. She did have the good grace to apologise, but she said that our Mrs. Fortescue was insisting on complete secrecy and there was nothing else for it.
Did that strike you as odd?
You mean the secrecy? Well, not entirely. If you could have seen the dear lady in the company of her son that evening, there was no question that she found his manner most unsettling. And then, as Matron often pointed out, she was a shade, shall we say, fey.
What precisely was the matron's word for it?
Well, dotty, as I recall.
The accused considered her partner in this alleged business venture to be dotty. Thank you, Mrs. Halls. No further questions.
Did she generally treat her as dotty, Mrs. Halls, as though she were senile or incompetent?
Oh, dear me, no, on the contrary. They were most friendly. Unusually so, really.
I see.
In fact, I remember remarking to Matron how nice if she could have been as chummy with some of our other residents.
Yes. And you yourself, are you fond of Miss Behan?
Oh, dear. Well, I would certainly say I was, until all this trouble.
Ah, yes, after which your attitude changed, yes? So much so that you terminated Miss Behan's employment. You sacked her.
Well, under the circumstances.
What circumstances, madam?
It was written in her contract, you understand, not to accept money from residents. Naturally, that's a strict rule for all our staff. Old people, you know, some of them are rather inclined to try and, well, buy affection, special attention, and so forth.
Nevertheless, matron, Mrs. Halls, I apologise. The matron's case was rather different, was it not, in that she was receiving finance for a business venture?
She'd accepted money, a very large sum, and that was an end to it.
However, before this development, you were fond of the accused.
Mark you, we did have our moments of discord.
Wasn't it true, madam, that Miss Behan was often critical of your management?
You see, Mrs.
Miss Lewis.
But of course, one has to understand, Mrs. Lewis, that at the Hallbert Martin home, we do welcome what one hopes is a generally exclusive class of guest.
In that they have to be able to afford £75 a week.
If you wish to express it in those terms. However, since Matron's background was rather less, shall we say, fortunate, and since she had worked at local authority homes where they do allow rather different standards, it made for differences of opinion between us.
Quite. In fact, did Matron not tell you that she would very much like to run a nursing home of her own?
Indeed she did. On several occasions, most particularly when she... Oh, dear, perhaps I shouldn't.
Mrs. Halls, you may speak with frankness.
You see, your worship, your lordship, I wouldn't want to give a wrong impression. Miss Behan was always most correct in her duties as matron, at least until all this trouble with our Mrs. Fortescue. However, the fact was that on her off-duty days she was given to, indulgences.
You mean she would drink? Yeah.
But of course one has to allow for a person's background in these matters. And of course the Irish are notorious.
Mrs. Halls, if we may return to the original question, you're saying the accused expressed a definite intention of starting up a private nursing home of her own?
Yes, often.
It's not unusual, is it, for private nursing homes to be founded in this way, Mrs. Halls?
I beg your pardon?
Well, someone with experience and qualifications going into partnership with an ageing patron prepared to finance the venture?
Well, I suppose...
Is not that how you yourself started 20 years ago in the business? Wasn't Sir John Hallbert Martin, then 81 years old, your patron and your partner?
The case of the Queen against Behan will be resumed tomorrow in the Crown Court.